Welcome back to the 240SX project, where today we're going to be assembling the block. So the associated moving parts of the block, such as the rod and the piston, you're going to want to do an inspection. Make sure there's scratching or burrs, big end and small end of the rod, as well as the wrist pin area of the piston. And you'll also take the wrist pin itself, slide it in and out of the piston, make sure there's no catching, no binding. Then we'll take our assembly lube, we'll lube up the wrist pin as we prepare it to enter into the piston. And then you'll also want to get some lube into the small end of the rod, but not the big end. Big end has to stay dry for the bearings. So let's get a little more lube here. We'll do the inside of the piston as well, and the recess areas where the wrist pin will slide into just before we start our assembly. Make sure you reference the service manual to ensure which direction that the tangs will go in the rod, and then we'll go ahead and slide everything together, ensure that everything fits. No binding, no catching. Everything looks great so far. So then we'll take our clips here. You'll have one on each side of the piston. These hold the wrist pin inside of the piston. Be careful, if you tend to put too much tension, it hasn't clipped in yet, and it takes off on you, it will spring across the garage. Probably won't find it. Make sure you do like a small function check and make sure that everything rocks back and forth. No catching, no binding. Smooth action. Go ahead and put it back here. So once you're done, what I like to do is put all my rods and pistons along the wall just to kind of get in the habit of having my rods and pistons in basically the order you're going to have them when they go into the motor. This extra set I have here is just for a spare motor I'm building, but just doing lots here in the garage. Now these are mainly pistons, and for the 2JZ they do require a 3 to 4 thou piston to wall clearance. So I'm going to measure these pistons and then the cylinder bores and see where we fall at. Stock or aftermarket, you always want to size your rings. You want to make sure you get the gap that you want according to the power levels and boost you're going to make. Use feeler gauges to go ahead and measure out. Get a good feeler gauge that has both inches and millimeters on it. When you put piston rings also in here, by the way, you want to use a piston you have on the side to go ahead and square it into the bore. Now, if the gap is too small, you're going to want to go ahead and file those open a little bit. This is a small wooden block with some screws I went and put together to make a tool to hold the ring in place. Then once you're done, you go ahead and size it back into the bore, grab your feeler gauges, see where your measurements comes out to, and you're just going to keep doing this until you get the measurement that you want, which we do have. So then we move on to our filing. You want to go ahead and file the edges smooth, no burrs, because you don't want any burrs touching each other while rings are operating within a cylinder bores. You'll also do this to your second compression ring. Again, make sure there's no bores, and make sure you file everything evenly. You don't want any uneven edges here. Now again, for the sake of consistency, as you line up your pistons and rods along the wall in the order they're going to be going into the block, you do the same thing with the rings. Keep them with the pistons. And these can be some of the parts we'll be putting into our block: ARP hardware, ACL bearings, and brand new thrust bearing. So now we're going to go ahead and disassemble the caps on the block on the bottom side because we want to put in some fresh ACL bearings. It doesn't really matter in which order you take these apart because there's no torque that's been placed on them. There's no crank in here. There's no rotating assembly. Rods, pistons, there is nothing. This is a bare block. So just go ahead and take all the caps out. And as you take the caps out, we're going to line them up in order they came out in. But luckily also, if you lose track where they came from, they are numbered. And there are small arrows casted on these caps that show which direction that they not only face the motor, but then also exactly what order that they go in. What I also like to do is take some compressed air and blow out any dust. Even though I keep this thing wrapped and covered at night, it's New Mexico, have no idea what dust is going to end up here overnight. Then I do a quick inspection, make sure there's no dirt, debris, any dust, or anything left over behind. And then we can start putting in our new bearings. So these bearings, you just want to clip them right in, and they do have a particular place where you sit. You'll see the tang on the bottom of the bearing, and it clicks right into that open recess there on the block. You'll do the same thing for the rest of them on the main caps. Just going to clip them right in. There's little tangs on the bottom that just clip right into place. Make sure they're snug. No assembly loop goes behind it. And here's all of them inserted into their main caps. Now, during this video, I did have hernia surgery. I had 4 hernias repaired, so I did use a lift to carefully install the crank into the block, being careful to make sure it doesn't hit, knock anything, and cause any burrs on any of the journals on the crank or main bearing side. And so now it's time to put in our ARP hardware into the block. Comes with lube, comes with all of the washers and the studs. Make sure everything is there before you start assembling everything. So this does come with its own lube. Make sure you use it. And then you're going to put these by hand into the block. You also want to make sure that you chase the threads, because when you have a block machine, there might be a little bit of the machining material left behind. You don't want anything catching or binding. I like to use the drill in the lowest settings. I put these in here because, for one, if it starts to catch or bind, I can feel it. And then also, two, it doesn't put a lot of torque when putting it all the way down, because once you put these in, you don't want them super tight. You want them just a little bit loose, which I do afterwards here. As mentioned before, you want these hand tight. So now that I've put them in lightly with a drill in the lowest setting, I will go back and I will loosen them up by about a quarter turn. Now we're going to go ahead and install our main caps. We're going to do this by hand. You also want to make sure that the bearings inside have some assembly lube on them. You're going to gently drop these in here. You don't want them knocking around and possibly jarring the bearing loose. The bearings are in there pretty good, held by the tangs, but I'm generally just a very cautious person when I'm assembling a motor. So you want to slide these on. Again, every single one of them is going to have the lube, and you want the cast arrows to face forward to the front of the engine towards the crank snout there. And then we'll just look over the motor, make sure everything's in place. And then I like to take the ARP nuts afterwards, and you want to take the lube and put it on the bottom of the nuts, as well as on the top and bottom of the washers as you place the washers down on top of these studs. So you do want a lot of lube. Again, don't be afraid to use a bit in there, because when you do your engine startup, you're going to be draining the oil afterwards anyway. So just keep putting these on by hand. We'll start to tighten them in a minute. Now when it comes to doing an initial fastening of your ARP hardware in the block, you want to make sure you start in the middle here and do a figure 8 or bow tie passes on here. Now this tool that I'm using is just to make the caps snug to the block surfaces. I will then come back after I've done this pass with my torque wrench. With the torque wrench starting from the middle, I do a figure 8 and a bow tie pass again from center, working my way out. 3 passes. First pass, 25 pounds. Second pass, 50 to 60 pounds. Third and final pass at 80 pounds. Also, make sure you have ARP lube under and on top of the washer and under the nut, as well as on the stud threads as well. It's almost time to install our rods and pistons, so we're going to go ahead and blow these areas out and make sure there's no dust, debris, or anything else inside. Now, before we put in the rods and pistons, we have to clean the bores. I like to use transmission fluid. Doesn't have to be Mercon, it could be ATF4, whatever you want to use. But put it on a very clean rag. Try to make sure that is a lint-free rag, because you're really not doing a whole lot of good for your motor cleaning it out if you're using a rag that's going to have a ton of lint that gets trapped inside. You'll see the first pass is extremely dirty. I go through about 3 rags every time I do this. So I use about a rag for 2-cylinder bores, and I switch out and go to a new rag and do it again. I use my palms, my fingers, the back of my fists, whatever I can to make sure I get all surface area covered within a block. And you want to keep doing this until it's clear, you don't get any more stuff on it. Okay, so now it's time to install a rod and piston combo. With the new ACL bearings you're going to put in, you're going to loosen up the big end cap of the rod, and you will take the bearings and you will gently place them into the cap and the main end of the rod. There are tangs that hold it in place, just like what they did in the block. You'll also want to make sure that when you're orientating your piston rings, that they are in the correct position per the service manuals. You don't want any of these gaps lined up, because if you do, then when the motor runs, you will lose compression in one of the cylinders. I use an Advanced Auto simple tool. You can buy this pretty much anywhere. They're $15, and you compress the piston rings inside of this, and you'll bring it over to your block to install into a cylinder bore. And as you're putting this in, you want to push it, you don't have to hammer it in. Okay, now plastic gauge is pretty controversial in a lot of builders. They say it's not that accurate, and I agree, it's probably not always accurate, but the service manual calls for it, so I use it. And lay it across the journal here, and then I put the caps on. I torque them in 2 passes. I start at 25 pounds and I go to 40 pounds to make sure we get a good even squeeze and crush on the plastic gauge. And then I'll take a small hammer and I will loosen up the bolts and then tap them out to make sure that there's separation from the main cap and the rod itself. That way when I remove the hardware, I can go ahead and grab it by hand, remove it, and then we can see what crush we got from the plastic gauge and get your measurement. And you can see the crush there on the plastic gauge that has happened, and we'll take what comes with our kit and measure it and see where our clearance is at, and we are within spec. Once everything's together, you want to go ahead and rotate the entire assembly to make sure there's no binding, nothing is catching. It should not be hard. If you have to force it, there might be something going on, but as you can see here, it rotates great. Everything comes up to the top, and from here I will measure the piston to deck clearance. So that's it for now. Next video, we'll show how to install the cylinder head.